Okay, at ease, troops. I say at ease. At ease. Oh, yeah. Wait till I fix this little piece of gear here. Yes, very good, very good. We're probably the only major outlet still using double-button carbon microphones. And do you agree? It adds a certain amount of interest to the sound there, right? It's okay. All right. Now, wait. Before I get started here, I have to start outlining policy here. All right. Everything's going under control there. Hey, what's the matter in there? Can't you get that queued up? You don't have to cue it from the beginning. Just set it down the middle then. Takes too long messing around like that, okay? I'm making a statement of policy here tonight. What's the matter? Did it go back again there, huh? Trouble? All right. Don't worry about it. If you can't get it going, doesn't matter. Speaking of not getting it going, I'm going to make a statement of policy here tonight, and it has to do with the Jew's harp, which is the instrument that I have occasionally played on this effort. And there's one thing that I have observed about the Jew's harp. Everybody who thinks he can play the Jew's harp, whenever he hears somebody else play the Jew's harp, is firmly convinced he plays the Jew's harp better than the person he's listening to. And furthermore, he invariably believes that it is some kind of a competitive instrument. Every time I play the Jew's harp, there's always about 5 yahoos who write, "Hey, I think you can't play the Jew's harp. You ain't got no beat, no waboo." And incidentally, that's also part of it, too. It is believed by all Jew's harp players that they alone possess a good ear and a sense of beat, as we call it in the trade. Please, if you will, just prepare the machine in there. Boy, you're not kidding. There is trouble. Listen to that. What's the matter? Oh, no. Something's the matter with the machine in there. What happened? Holy smokes. See what I told you? Double-button carbon mic. That's not the record that's doing that. So, oh, yes, every time I play this instrument, I get 50 letters from guys, "Oh, I challenge you." It's fascinating. I never thought of playing an instrument as a competition, like boxing, hockey. I suppose fiddle players, every time they go to a concert and they hear Isaac Stern, they send him letters. "You think you can play the fiddle? Listen, I'll challenge you to play the fiddle anytime you want to play the fiddle." Okay. Hold it. At ease. Route step. That's enough of that. Incidentally, one of the great displays, as far as I'm concerned, at the Smithsonian, is their display of classic and in some cases antique, and other cases historical aircraft. Fantastic airplanes there. Yeah. For example, Lindbergh's plane is there. One of the truly great aerobatic pilots, his airplane is there. It's an orange biplane, and I'll award you a brass filigree with bronze oak leaf palm if you can tell me the name of the pilot. His first name was Al, and the name of the airplane. Yeah, well, it was a beautiful airplane. It says Gulf Oil on the side of it. They sponsored him. Yeah. It was a beautiful, beautiful airplane, and it's hanging right there in the Smithsonian. And it's a weird story about that airplane, in case you're interested in airplanes. That aircraft was searched for a long time by aircraft historical buffs. This guy was a very famous pilot, a really famous pilot. And a pilot, there's certain pilots, among pilots of that particular era, that in a sense were like great ball players, playing in the big leagues. There were some guys that were just Ted Williams and other guys were journeymen. They were both pros, but in those days there were great pilots around. Do you know that one of the greatest aerobatic pilots in the world today is a woman? You didn't know that. As a matter of fact, she's a lady who looks like everybody's grandmother. You would think she's a dynamic-looking lady, looking like Raquel Welch or something. No, in fact, she represents the U.S. on the U.S. aerobatic team. She's on the U.S. aerobatic team. 5 great aerobatic pilots. I bet a lot of people are not aware that one of the most bitterly fought-out international competitions every year is the International Aerobatics Competition, which these teams from around the world compete in various cities every year. Like one year it'll be in Paris, the next year it'll be in Moscow or someplace like that, or it'll be in Helsinki. And these great teams battle it out. And our team is unique among world's aerobatic teams. I'm talking about the aerobatic teams that compete internationally, in that it's not a government operation. In fact, the aerobatic team that represents, say, the Soviet Union is a military team. Actually, it's these guys are all lieutenants in the Air Force. The planes are maintained by the Soviet Air Force and so on. And you can imagine what it would cost to be a member of this team when you realize that the airplane, for starters, probably will run you $50,000 for just starters, plus maintaining it, continually operating it, and all the rest of the stuff that goes into being a great aerobatics. Hey, what's happening here? A great aerobatics pilot. And we have some really great ones. We in fact, are very highly rated internationally now. Now, I don't know why I'm telling you about this, except that there's a sudden new interest in what could be called semi-historical flying now. In other words, there's been a whole spate of movies out about barnstorming and that sort of thing. And some of them are bad, others are not. But the whole field is fascinating. And I say, as a pilot, it's fascinating to me. I've met some of the pilots that were great pilots from time to time. In fact, I met the pilot who just did all the flying for a new Robert Redford movie called, let's see, what's it called? Waldo Peebles or something. Peebles? Waldo Pepper, that's it, the great Waldo Pepper. And incidentally, that's based, by the way, on a real barnstormer of the period. There was a Waldo, but his name was not Pepper, it was another name, and he barnstormed around the country. Now, the pilot who did all the flying for this was a great pilot, and is a great pilot, obviously, kind of a legendary pilot. It goes back into those days, back into the Lindbergh days. So when you see this plane on the screen doing all these wild stuff, it's being flown by a guy who's close to 70. Actually. And believe it or not, he's wearing a rubber Robert Redford mask. So if you believe, he did a lot of the flying, by the way, for the Blue Max, which was another. And in that particular movie, he wore a George Peppard rubber mask. So there'd be scenes of him flying this. In that case, he was playing Baron von Richthofen. He was flying a Fokker triplane, and there would be scenes of him in the airplane, which was not a real Fokker triplane, by the way, for those of you who are interested in true. There is no known Fokker triplane in existence. I hate to disillusion you, but you've seen pictures of the little Fokker triplane. There's no known Fokker triplane in existence. And the last one, there have been models built up, in other words, actual reproductions of original Fokker triplanes, where they took the original plans and actually built the plane, but it's a contemporary airplane. So if you go up to various air circuses and you see a Fokker triplane, that's not a real Fokker triplane, no way. However, ironically, the last known Fokker triplane that was in existence was in a museum in Berlin. And it was destroyed in a bombing raid during World War II. And nobody knows where it went from that point on. That is, the remains of what was left of it. But isn't it kind of ironical that the last warplane of World War I was destroyed in a bombing raid in World War II. That's actually the truth. But nevertheless, the bombing raid, just pow, it was gone. The Fokker triplane that you hear about a lot about was not a very big airplane. Incidentally, it was a copy. The Fokker triplane was not an original design. It was a copy of an original that was really the scourge at one point of the German pilots in World War I. They were really getting blasted. A plane built by Sopwith. It was a Sopwith triplane. And it was a very highly maneuverable airplane, quite slow, but extremely maneuverable. It could turn on a dime and could do pretty wild aerobatics at the time, for the time. And so the Germans needed a plane to counteract that. It was like we have an arms race today. Well, they had one in World War I. And so they quickly knocked together a copy of the Sopwith as best they could. They had a couple of captured Sopwiths, and they built a copy of the Sopwith, and that turned out to be what we called, what was called the Fokker triplane, or the DR-1, and very interesting airplane. Did you know that there were airplanes built at one time that had as many as 8 wings? There was an aircraft that flew that had a set of wings that looked almost like a Venetian blind. It gives you great lift, but it's also great drag, which means that the airplane moves very slowly through the air, but wow, it goes up and down real quick, just like a kite. Now, on the other hand, there were more advanced airplanes in World War I by far than the Fokker triplane. And just the only reason, I suppose, that the Fokker triplane is such a big deal with people who know very little about the aviation is that Baron von Richthofen was killed in a Fokker triplane. It was not his airplane either. That was another piece of irony, that if you are a student of the period, the aircraft that he was actually shot down in was not his actual aircraft. His aircraft was being repaired. It was down for maintenance, and he had borrowed an aircraft for that day. So if you think that he was shot down in this blood-red triplane, he was not. If you see paintings of the moment when he was shot down, he was not shot down, by the way, by the man who was given credit and is given official credit for it over the years. He was actually shot down, according to the most recent research, by a ground battery. He was hit by a piece of ground fire that came up through the aircraft, to the bottom of the aircraft, and literally killed him right there instantly. And he was killed by a machine gun slug that was fired by an Australian battery, an Australian anti-aircraft battery. The guy was using a homemade sight, and of course it wasn't much of a feat, really, because he was flying at such a low altitude, at 100, 150 feet right over, and the plane is moving rather slowly compared to today's airplanes, and zap, he hit him with the machine gun. Now, that was the one time that von Richthofen did actually broke his own rules. He was a great air strategist and tactician. And he, do you know that there's still a squadron in the Luftwaffe named after Richthofen? There is a Richthofen squadron in the German Air Force, and they have the same insignia that he had on his airplane, which was a crest with an R and so on, the family crest of the von Richthofen. And he was a great strategist, and he was an absolute disciplinarian. He was the head of this squadron. He was the squadron leader, and he was a great disciplinarian, and he maintained absolute flight discipline. And one of his rules was never leave the protection of the flight when you're in the middle of a combat with other aircraft, and never ever fly at the altitudes down low over ground fire, because that's mean stuff, and that's what got him. Nobody knows why he broke his own rule that particular day. And when the plane went down, for those of you who are curious about all this, when the plane went down, it went down between the lines. It didn't go down in behind the lines. It went down between the lines, and a whole crowd of British and Australian troops roared out of their trenches and literally stripped the airplane as stripped as a skeleton in about 30 seconds looking for souvenirs because they recognized that this event around Richthofen. He was not flying a red airplane, by the way. He was flying a maroon one that day. The plane was not his, and it was painted maroon. Now, why was his plane red? Most people think, well, it must have been showbiz. Not at all. His plane was painted red. Von Richthofen used this red aircraft so that his fellow pilots in his squadron could recognize his aircraft. See, in those days, they didn't have the kind of radio intercoms that we have now. So when he would waggle his wings, meaning reform, regroup, we are going to leave the scene, he wanted his pilots to know that this was him. So he would waggle the old wings, you know, and that red plane was the reason for the high visibility. Now, a lot of other pilots had fantastic colored airplanes in those days. That was kind of a big thing in those days, that it was a common. For example, one of the famous German aces had a plane. His plane, he was really a famous pilot. In fact, he was famous for having the single most spectacular dogfight ever fought by a single pilot. He fought off for about 20 minutes, right over no man's land. He fought 7 British SE-5s, which was a much better airplane than he was flying. In other words, he was outclassed. For starters, the aircraft that he was fighting against was better than the one he was flying. Anyway, he fought these guys for about 20 minutes, 7 of them, one guy. And he battled them all over the sky. And great crowds of GIs down on the ground were cheering. It was a fantastic sporting event. Can you imagine Howard Cosell describing that? Would have been fantastic. So his plane, now if you think the red is great, his airplane was painted with violet-colored wings. He was flying a Fokker D7 rather, which was a biplane, a great airplane, by the way. He flew. There is one of these biplanes, a Fokker D7, still visible. There are several around, and one of them can be seen if you ever go to Munich, in the Museum of Science and Technique in Munich. And you can actually climb up and look down the cockpit, and here's this old Fokker D7, which is a great airplane. It's the classic Fokker, really. And if you want to know who Fokker was, it was a man named Tony Fokker, Anthony Fokker, who was a great Dutch aircraft designer, not German, Dutch. And he designed aircraft. In fact, he designed the airplane that was the revolutionary airplane that really set the whole trend for today's commercial flying. The Ford trimotor was a Fokker design. Or did you know that? That was originally known as the Fokker trimotor, and Ford built it in Detroit. Did you know the Ford company built airplanes at one point? And old Henry Ford himself hated flying. Yeah, he just wouldn't fly. But they built the great airplane. They built this trimotor, which there are still several models extant. You've seen pictures of the Ford trimotor. Well, actually, that's the Fokker trimotor, built by Ford under license. And a great airplane, Pratt & Whitney engines whirling away up there in the front. And why did that airplane go out? Well, there was a disastrous air crash. And in the early 30s, a disastrous air crash, and the life of a very famous man was snuffed out in that air crash. And at that point, that airplane became everybody sort of put it down, and it just disappeared quickly from the scene. But it wasn't really the aircraft's fault. It just happened that was the plane. Who was that man? I'll tell you, I'll give you a clue. He was a great sports figure. And while we're on the subject of this kind of, I don't know why I'm doing this. As a pilot, I was fascinated when I could imagine Frank Tallman sitting in a Jenny, which is the airplane used generally, I think, in Waldo Pepper. It's a Jenny, DH-4 possibly. I'm not sure whether they used the DH-4 or a Jenny. DH-4 is the de Havilland, the de Havilland 4, which was the airplane that became very famous. It was a World War I bomber, but actually it was turned out by the thousands in World War I, and later became the famous mail plane of the 20s. Lindbergh, for example, was one of the great mail pilots of all time. And if you want to read an exciting book about that period, pick up The Spirit of St. Louis, written by Lindbergh. He's a fine writer, you know. And his accounts of of the early mail flying was incredible. Do you know one time he flew from St. Louis, you see. His flight was a regular flight from St. Louis to Chicago, and they flew night after night, day after day, nighttime flying, with no instruments at all. They didn't have the kind of radio or anything. And they flew instrument flying, though. And it was really instrument flying. So one night, he was flying to Chicago in his DH-4 open cockpit, of course, and they knew every piece of ground between St. Louis and Chicago. But he was flying one night, and he flew over what he knew where the airport was, but there was such an incredible fog. There was no way he could not land. So he tried to make it back, and it had fogged in behind him. See, weather reporting was very bad in those days. So he was running low on fuel. This is Lindbergh. He was running low on fuel. And suddenly he realized that there's no way. It was absolutely nothing but this white around him, this dark, it was night, nothing but this white fog around him. And he tried everything. He shot flares off, trying everything else to see where he was, and there was no way. So he knew he had to hit the silk. And he did. He just flipped out of the airplane. And then what the airplane did is fascinating. And he was very low. That was another thing. He was at an altitude of about 200 or 300 feet. He was just really, really low. Sure, because he was trying to find out where he was. See, he knew he couldn't get back up. It takes an hour for this airplane to get up to 8,000 feet. He didn't have the fuel, so out he went. And the airplane circled. Then he heard it coming back through the fog. The airplane is flying, and it came back, and he saw it coming right at him. And my God, he says, this is it. He says, Lindbergh says, of all the times in his life, he knew that this was the end. The airplane is coming right at him. And he says, the last minute, the airplane's wing just raised up like that, and it just, wow, she roared around him. Well, then he's hanging in the chute, and he's on his way down. He says, oh, my God, unbelievable. And just then he hears this thing circling in the dark, and she comes right back out of the dark again. It circled around him, and every time it was getting closer. He says, one more revolution and it would have been all over, because the circle was tightening. The airplane was flying by itself, and he hit the ground and rolled over, and he heard the plane roar over him in the dark. Give me sound. You want to hear the sound of a DH-4 engine? This is the kind of engine. That's the sound of a DH-4 Liberty engine. That's exactly what it was. She just roared right over him with that gigantic prop banging away there. And he landed in a field, rolled over twice. Busted an ankle. He rolled over twice, and off in the distance, way off, he could hear this. He heard the airplane crash, and they didn't find it till well into the next morning. Fantastic scenes. But flying for a camera is a very interesting experience, and if you'll hang on, as a pilot who did that at one point in one sequence, I will tell you how it is to fly for the camera, which is very different from conventional flying. You want to hear more about airplanes? All right. This is a subject that much is said about and little is known by the average layperson, and flying for camera is a very interesting experience. Now, when you say you fly for camera, that's different than just flying. If you're flying an aircraft, you fly your aircraft in a certain way, using certain legal procedures and technical procedures. However, when you're flying for a camera, you have a whole different set of things to think about. And for those of you who ever saw my television show, Gene Shepard's America, you will remember one show was about private flying and my involvement in it. In fact, the airplane that was in that particular show happens to be my own private airplane. And I flew all the flying sequences naturally, and that's since it is about private flying. But we flew this. We picked an area, you see, that was, first of all, very photogenic from the air. Certain areas, if you fly over them, even at 2,000 feet, 1,500 feet, maybe 3,000, maybe 5,000 feet, really don't have much to offer from looking from the vantage point of down, up, down. If you're up there, you just see this rather nondescript countryside below you. So there are a lot of ways to pick ground for pictures. One, of course, is to get us the most spectacular scenery. For example, shoot your sequences in the Sierras. You're going to have a lot of wild-looking mountains around you when you fly. On the other hand, it's interesting if you get something, say, like a really colorful desert. So you're doing your sequences over desert. The ground has a reddish-orange color to it. Now, we picked an area outside of Boston, right near Cape Cod, where much of the flying could be done over water and islands. And you could see this green ground, this great green country below us with lines of beaches and waves coming in and islands below us. And we looked all around. We've picked this area outside of Boston, about 45 minutes outside of Boston in the direction of the Cape. And then we had to worry about weather. And, of course, you have a whole camera crew. You have two cameramen working this thing. This was actually taped, but you had these two. You had one guy working the tape equipment, one guy working the camera. You had an audio man. You had two or three other people who did other technical work on the actual shooting of the thing. And all these people had to be scheduled, you see, for this particular day. And so every day we had problems with weather. We would schedule this thing for, say, a Sunday or a Saturday afternoon, and then it would be raining like crazy. No way. So we needed that color, you see. We wanted the color and the beauty. So finally it was getting so late in our shooting schedule that we ultimately had to shoot it in spite of the fact that it wasn't an ideal day. In fact, it was just what we call, a flyer's terminology, marginal VFR, really marginal. There was a fine rain mist falling, and it can get pretty interesting flying out in that part of the country because you can suddenly get yourself into some really bad weather. Well, we arranged this very carefully with myself and the other pilot, the pilot that was flying the camera plane, which was a larger aircraft. For those of you who are into airplanes, he was flying a Cessna 180 that was modified with a slightly larger bore engine than the conventional 180. This is a tail-dragging airplane with no doors. The doors had been removed on the side to shoot out of the airplane. It was a camera plane. Very expensive, by the way, to rent. Imagine what that costs, including pilots and the insurance and the whole bit. So we were flying out of a very small airport, a beautiful little airport, where this, in fact, the whole sequence was set on a private airport that is very much, truly a pilot's airport. It's a little airport called Tumac, which is outside of Boston. Tumac. It's all green. And in fact, the runways are cut right through what looks like green evergreen forests. And they had two runways, intersecting runways. One was grass, the other was paved, but the paved runway was rather short. I think around 2,100 feet, something like 2,200 feet. And that's rather short, but a small, narrow runway cutting right down through the trees. Well, we took off. We very carefully calculated our course. And you have to fly at precise altitudes. Now, the reason for this is that once you get up there, it's difficult for the people who are operating the equipment to refocus all your equipment. And we have to get the angles of the light just right. So it wouldn't do much good, really, for me to be up there and him taking pictures, and the aircraft is in its own shadow, for example, or there's bad lighting. The light is from the wrong angle. The light coming in towards the camera and could cause us problems of focusing and backlighting and all. So everything had to be carefully calculated. So we got up to 2,000 feet, which is our agreed-on altitude, because we wanted the ground to show too. And we flew the course towards the sea. Now, we had other problems, and that is the differential in speed between the aircraft. He was flying a much larger aircraft, of course. It was a big, powerful airplane because it was carrying all his gear and everything. And I was flying a small sport two-seater, and it was somewhat slower than his aircraft, although much more maneuverable. Would be like one guy's in a Caddy and another guy's in an MG Midget. So we're flying at 2,000 feet, and he kept making passes. We had arranged to do this so that if he throttled back too much, we would get excessive vibration. Again, that has to be considered. All these things, So we decided on an optimum speed, a pass speed for him. And as he went past me, he would be going a certain speed. Now, I had to always angle my aircraft in a certain way so that the light was just right, so it had all the color was there, and he could also see the ground. In the meantime, by the way, I had to fly the airplane. So this was getting very interesting, especially since no sooner were we up there and we began to shoot when the weather began to rapidly deteriorate. Oh, wow. Which meant that the wind was picking up, the haze was getting more involved, and also we were beginning to get turbulence because there was an unpredicted front moving in, and we were being tossed around. Well, at that point, he had to make a pass past me, but instead of doing the close pass we had arranged for, he had to drift out a little further because we were afraid of a collision. So here we were flying. We had to get, incidentally, all this had to be approved by the FAA. We had to, this is not just casual stuff. So he was flying out past me. Well, we finally got the what we considered the shots that we wanted. At that point, he gave me the sign, saying he just did a wing over, and he took off hell-bent for election for the airport. Well, I saw him disappear. He just put that throttle right down to the right down to the fireboard, and he just took off because he wanted to get back because the weather was really falling apart at that point. Well, I saw him disappear into the distance, and I was flying. I gained some altitude. I got up to 3,000 feet, so I could get a little more, just a little more visibility. And at that point, of course, the ground is disappearing now in the haze. Do you find this fascinating? Well, I was heading back to that airport, and the haze is coming in, and the rain is coming in, and I decided that I was going to go back to my original altitude, 2,000 feet, which I did, and I overflew the airport purposely. I wanted to see if everything. I saw him coming in, and he was having some time. I saw that airplane because we were getting really strong crosswind gusts at that point. And his wing went down, and he just laid that thing down, and he just taxied out. And I could see him. I saw his wing drop twice, really badly. And I called down on the Unicom, and the guy says, we're really getting some mean 90-degree gusts on that runway. And it's the only one we could use at that point. So he said they're gusting up to 25, 30 knots gust. So I said, okay, so I'm going to take a long, low, hot approach. So I did. I laid it down on the trees, and I just bore it in, and it was fantastic because I could see the cameramen and all those guys down there waiting, and they were photographing it as I came in. I said, this is liable to be some fantastic sequence. Well, as I taxied out, I tell you, the sweat was just running down because it looked so idyllic on the screen. If you saw it on the screen, it looked like the greatest fun in the world. But the sweat that was going on, and this is kind of the payoff. The director, being a true director, he knew nothing about flying at all. So he just sitting in the airplane. He didn't know. Couldn't figure out why I didn't just follow him in, And the cameraman, none of them knew anything about flying. Only myself and the pilot. So the other guy. So and here it is. It's beginning to rain now badly with a really driving mist coming in. And the director says to me, he says, "Hey, Shep." I says, "Yes, Fred." He said, "Hey, listen, why don't you and Joe go up and we could get some great shots of you guys flying in the mist and the rain. It'd be terrific." Come on. I looked over at Joe. He's so mad. And so what appears on the screen to be rather fun and casual is almost invariably exactly the opposite, especially when it comes to flying. It was a great experience, and I learned a lot that afternoon. Precision flying, one thing and another, but boring back to that airport with that weather socking in like that, and seeing that 180 practically do a wing over when she went into the final, well, she was in her final approach, and she really got racked, and the final moments when the director says, "Hey, why don't you guys go up? It'd be great to see." I says, "Oh, wow, it must be great." Innocence is a great thing to have, I say. It is. Ignorance is bliss. Really, nothing is more dangerous than a little knowledge. That's right. But, and so I think a lot of people see things on the screen and think, how groovy, wouldn't it be fun? And they don't realize what's behind all of it. Maybe it's best they don't.
By recording from New York, you've been listening to Inside Gene Shepherd. Our next Shepherd program can be heard next Tuesday beginning at 6:30. And don't forget, next Friday, beginning at 6:30, we have a special Shepherd program for our Shepherd listeners, so we hope you can be on hand at that time. Right now, it's 7 minutes after 7 o'clock. Our temperature is 56 degrees, and in tonight's news...